He wore the weight of a nation, but he carried the scars of a man. When Abraham Lincoln stepped into the White House in 1861, he didn't walk through those doors as a conqueror. He entered as a wounded soul stepping into the fire. The United States was fractured, split down its moral spine. 11 states had already seceded. War was brewing. The drums of destruction were beating louder than ever. But even louder than those drums was the internal storm that never left Lincoln's heart, because while the world was preparing for civil war, Lincoln was fighting another war. No one could see the war inside his own mind. Pain didn't wait for permission in his life. It had always been there, a shadow companion from childhood. Now, as president, it came in stronger waves. The pressure, the criticism, the hate, the weight of decisions that would cost thousands of lives, all of it became a constant echo in his soul. The country was falling apart, and he felt it not just politically, but personally. Every letter from a grieving mother, every report from the battlefield, every angry speech from his enemies. It didn't just challenge his position, it pierced his heart. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, he was haunted. And yet, every morning he got up and showed up, because leadership isn't about feeling ready, it's about being relentless. Lincoln wasn't bulletproof, he was bleeding, but he led anyway. And that's what makes his story so powerful. He wasn't some untouchable titan of history. He was a man made of flesh, sorrow, and bone, standing in the middle of chaos, refusing to break. He didn't hide his struggles, he faced them, carried them, and still managed to serve a cause bigger than himself. That is the highest form of strength, to keep building while everything inside you is breaking. As the Civil War exploded across the nation, Lincoln was mocked relentlessly. Newspapers called him incompetent. Critics labeled him a baboon. His generals defied him. His own cabinet doubted him. And through it all he bore the unbearable, the death of his beloved son Willie in 1862. It crushed him. Some say it nearly destroyed him. That grief wasn't political. It was human. It was raw. It was real. And still, he did not quit. He didn't abandon the people who needed him. He didn't fold under the grief. He carried on, because he knew that leadership during ease means nothing, but leadership during agony defines destiny. That's the thing about Lincoln. He never claimed to be perfect. He didn't posture. He didn't pretend. He was humble, painfully aware of his flaws. But he was also courageous in a way few ever are. He took on the presidency not for fame, but for purpose, and that purpose demanded everything he had. His peace, his family, his health, his joy. He gave it all, not because it was easy, but because it was right. While battles raged at Gettysburg and beyond, Lincoln's mind never rested. He walked the halls of the White House late at night, often alone, pondering speeches that would shape the soul of America. Words weren't just tools for him, they were weapons of change. And when he delivered the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, it wasn't just a document, it was a declaration of moral fire, a decision that drew the line between history and humanity, a decision that took courage beyond politics, the kind of courage that changes nations. He didn't know how it would end. He had no guarantee that the war would be won, no certainty that freedom would triumph, but he made the call anyway, because real leaders don't wait for perfect timing, they create the moment. And in that moment, Lincoln shifted the war from one about union to one about freedom. He made it about something worth dying for, and that choice redefined America forever. But the backlash was immediate. The North was divided, the South enraged. Even some of his own allies turned cold. But Lincoln didn't lead by popularity. He led by principle, and when the Battle of Gettysburg left over 50,000 Americans dead, Lincoln traveled to that blood-soaked field, not just to speak, but to heal. The Gettysburg Address, just 271 words, is still one of the most iconic speeches in history, not because it was loud, but because it was true. In just a few minutes, he reminded the nation what it was fighting for, not just territory, but a test of whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He gave that speech not as a conqueror, but as a man with tear-stained eyes and a heart burdened by the cost of his convictions. He didn't romanticize war. He honored the fallen. He didn't make himself the hero. He made freedom the hero. And in doing so, he reawakened the American spirit in the darkest of hours. Yet the darkness didn't end. The war dragged on. Blood kept flowing, and Lincoln, weary, haunted, grieving, pressed forward. That's what greatness looks like. Not smiling through pain, but walking through it with purpose. Not dodging pressure, but standing inside it and refusing to back down. Every day Lincoln faced death threats, sabotage, betrayal, and every day he put the nation before himself. This is what most people don't understand. Power didn't protect Lincoln, it exposed him. It made him vulnerable to deeper wounds, harsher critics, heavier burdens, and still, he stayed. Still, he led. Because when you're built for purpose, comfort isn't the goal. Impact is. He didn't chase legacy, he chased justice, and justice demanded sacrifice. Lincoln sacrificed everything but his soul. He never let hate change him, never let bitterness define him. He stayed humble, kind, and focused on unity, even as enemies painted him as a tyrant, even as newspapers tore him down, even as allies betrayed him. He held the line not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And that's the message we all need to hear. In a world addicted to instant success, Lincoln's life screams a different truth. Real impact takes time. It takes pain. It takes perseverance. You don't inspire the world by being perfect. You inspire the world by being real and relentless. That's who Abraham Lincoln was. In 1864, as his re-election campaign began, the odds were against him again. The war had dragged on too long. The country was exhausted. And still, Lincoln campaigned not on promises of peace, but on the truth. He stood for continuing the fight until slavery was dead and the Union preserved. He didn't pander, he led with vision. And in November, the people responded. He was re-elected, not because everything was going well, but because people saw that he wouldn't quit on them. But the victory was bittersweet. As the war neared its end, Lincoln knew the price had been staggering. Over 600,000 lives lost, a nation bruised and bleeding. And yet, through it all, his heart never hardened. In his second inaugural address, another speech of simplicity and soul, he didn't celebrate conquest. He called for healing, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He said, those weren't just words. That was Lincoln's essence. He didn't seek revenge. He sought reconciliation. He didn't want to punish the South. He wanted to rebuild the Union. And that's where his greatness shines brightest. Not in how he won, but in how he chose to heal. He saw enemies not as people to crush, but as brothers to restore. He led with moral courage, the kind of courage that bends history, the kind of courage that walks through hell and still chooses hope. But fate had one more test for Abraham Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, just days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. It was supposed to be a moment of peace, a breath after years of war. A night of rest for a man who had carried the soul of a nation. But just after 10 p.m., John Wilkes Booth fired a bullet into the back of Lincoln's head. The man who had failed for 3 decades, who had carried pain like a cross, who had saved the Union, who had freed the enslaved, who had stood for the soul of a divided country, died not in glory, but in silence. But you see, that's the thing about men like Lincoln. You can kill the body, but you cannot kill the legacy. Because legacy is not built in speeches or titles. It's built in moments of pain, in decisions made when no one is watching, in years of silent, thankless effort. Lincoln didn't just change history, he earned his place in it with scars, tears, wisdom, and will. And that is why his name endures, not because he was born special, but because he refused to quit, because he stood up every single time the world knocked him down, because he led with integrity when power begged him to compromise. Because he turned his private pain into public purpose, because he didn't wait to be remembered, he acted in a way that could never be forgotten. So the next time life breaks you down, the next time you fail, lose, fall, or question your purpose, think of Abraham Lincoln, think of the log cabin, the failures, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the war, the grief, the bullet, and then think of what still remained, his impact. He failed his way to greatness, and so can you. The final breath of Abraham Lincoln did not mark the end of his story, it marked the beginning of his legend. On the morning of April 15, 1865, as the sun rose over a country barely stitched back together by war, its greatest leader lay cold and silent, the man who had guided America through its bloodiest chapter, who had freed millions with the stroke of a pen, who had endured mockery, rejection, heartbreak, and war, was gone, assassinated not on a battlefield, but in a theater. Killed not for failing but for succeeding, for uniting, for liberating, for daring to believe that this torn nation could still live up to its founding promise. And yet, in his death, Abraham Lincoln became something more than a man. He became a symbol, not of perfection, but of perseverance, not of royalty, but of resilience, not of wealth or privilege, but of a relentless journey from nothing to everything, powered only by grit, vision, and moral fire. A legacy carved not in gold, but in pain, in scars, in failure after failure, in rising every time life tried to bury him. He wasn't the first American president, but he was the first to truly make America confront itself. He didn't just manage a country, he held a mirror to it. He forced it to look at its sins, to reckon with slavery, to acknowledge the cost of injustice. He turned his own suffering into a lesson for the entire nation. That greatness demands sacrifice, and progress demands pain. That silence is complicity, and action, no matter how hard, is the only path forward. Think about this. Lincoln was never supposed to succeed. Every card was stacked against him. No wealth, no powerful family, no elite connections. His formal schooling, less than a year. His early life, a graveyard of failures. And yet, by sheer force of will, he didn't just rise, he reshaped the world around him. Because while most people seek comfort, Lincoln sought meaning. And meaning is found in hardship, not ease. Even in his final days, he carried himself with humility. No security detail, no arrogance, just a quiet man, tired from years of war, still dreaming of a reunited America. He had plans for healing, for rebuilding, for peace. But fate had other ideas. A coward's bullet ended the man, but not the movement, not the ideals, not the legacy, because some lives are so purposeful, so powerful, they continue long after the heart stops beating. Abraham Lincoln's face would soon be carved into mountains, his name etched in marble, his speeches taught in every classroom. But none of that is what made him great. What made him great was his spirit, his ability to keep standing when everything and everyone tried to knock him down, his refusal to surrender his values, even when they cost him votes, friends, and peace, his courage to do what was right, even when it wasn't popular. That is what makes Lincoln more than a historical figure. That's what makes him a North Star for every person walking through fire, battling demons, or climbing uphill without a rope. He taught us that leadership is not about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the calm in the storm. It's about being steady when the world is shaking, about listening when others shout, about healing when others hate, and more than anything, about walking with purpose even when you're limping from the pain. His entire life was a roadmap for those who feel unworthy, overlooked, broken, or behind. He showed us that where you start means nothing, that failure is not final, that losing doesn't mean you're lost. He proved that pain can become power, that rejection can build resilience, that hardship doesn't break you, it builds you. When Lincoln died, the crowds didn't mourn a politician. They mourned a father figure, a moral compass, a soul who had suffered with them and for them. His funeral train took a 13-day journey across the country, and millions gathered in silence. Grown men wept, mothers clutched their children. Former slaves stood in reverent awe, because this was not just a funeral, it was a farewell to a man who had carried the hopes of a broken nation on his back and walked forward anyway. And even today, more than a century and a half later, his story still speaks to us, because the world is still filled with failure, with fear, with injustice. And we're still tempted to give up, to grow bitter, to lose faith. But then we remember Lincoln. We remember that the most powerful man in the world was once a barefoot boy in the woods with nothing but dreams and scars. That greatness doesn't require a crown, it requires courage. So if you're doubting yourself, look to Lincoln. If you've been counted out, rejected, forgotten, look to Lincoln. If you've failed more times than you can count, if you're tired, wounded, exhausted, look to Lincoln, because his story is proof that what breaks most people built him. He didn't just fail his way to greatness. He failed, learned, adapted, stood back up, and kept going with fire in his chest. That's what makes him immortal. The truth is, Abraham Lincoln didn't just lead a country. He taught the human race how to endure, how to rise, how to turn sorrow into strength. He showed us that we don't need to be born great to become great. We just need to believe that the fight is worth it, and then fight until the end. Long after the last cannon went silent, after the smoke of war lifted from the American soil, after the mournful hymns of Lincoln's funeral faded into history, something deeper remained, something no assassin could take, something no war could erase. It was his legacy, not just of a leader, but of a blueprint for the broken. His life wasn't a polished biography. It was a series of bruises, stitched together by perseverance. He didn't rise to power with noise. He climbed in silence. He struggled in the dark. He built a name not through entitlement, but through endurance. Lincoln didn't speak often, but when he did, his words etched themselves into history like stone. Why? Because he didn't speak to impress, he spoke to inspire. His voice carried weight not from volume, but from authenticity. There was no performance in his leadership, no show, no mask, just a man, raw, real, flawed, daring to lead with truth in a time where lies were more convenient. And that's why he's still quoted, still studied, still revered, because he spoke the kind of truths that don't expire, truths about freedom, about unity, about the human soul. But Lincoln's greatness wasn't found in what he said. It lived in what he endured, the criticism, the grief, the unbearable loneliness of being the one who sees clearly when the world is blind. He knew the sting of rejection. He knew the ache of loss. He knew what it meant to carry more than you were built for and to still walk forward. Because that's what greatness demands, not perfection, but perseverance, not talent, but tenacity. This is the part of the story they don't teach in classrooms. Lincoln didn't just carry a nation, he carried the invisible weight that destroys most men, the burden of vision. He saw America not as it was, but as it could be, and vision is a painful gift. Because when you see what's possible, you're constantly at war with what is. And Lincoln fought that war every single day, not just with policies, but with his very presence. He knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, to be mocked, to be ridiculed for standing alone. And yet he stood again and again, because vision without courage is just imagination. And Lincoln's courage wasn't loud or showy, it was quiet, composed, deadly in its resolve. He didn't need the crowd to clap, he needed the future to remember. In a world obsessed with noise, Lincoln's legacy is a thunderclap of silence. He proved you don't need to scream to make history, you just need to refuse to break. And he never did. Not when his business collapsed. Not when love eluded him, not when elections humiliated him, not when depression crushed his chest like iron, not when his son died in his arms, not when the country tore itself to shreds, not when half the nation wanted his head. He never broke. Because the strongest men are not those who lift the most. They are those who carry the heaviest burdens without complaint. He knew he wasn't the smartest. He knew he wasn't the most handsome, the most powerful, the most popular. But he didn't care, because he wasn't here to be liked, he was here to be useful. And usefulness is a forgotten virtue in today's world. Everyone wants attention, but Lincoln wanted impact. Everyone wants fame. Lincoln wanted freedom not just for himself, but for everyone shackled by injustice. He didn't chase destiny, he became it. And now, more than 150 years after his final breath, his presence lingers, not just in monuments or museums, but in every man or woman who's ever felt unworthy and kept going anyway. In every underdog who refused to quit. In every soul that took one more step through pain, through failure, through doubt, just like Lincoln did. Because his story isn't a history lesson, it's a human instruction manual. You will fail, you will fall, but if you rise again and again, you cannot be forgotten. There's a reason his face is carved into mountains, but the mountain he truly conquered wasn't granite, it was the mountain of the human spirit. He proved that the climb is what makes the view worth it. That suffering isn't a curse, it's the chisel that shapes character. That isolation isn't weakness, it's the birthplace of strength. He showed us that leadership isn't found in power, it's found in purpose. And now, in the age of fast fame and overnight success, Lincoln's life reminds us of the ancient truth. Real greatness is slow, it's painful, it's earned. The road is long, filled with failure, loneliness, and obscurity. But if you walk it with integrity, the world will follow. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, they will. Because you don't need to be born with privilege. You don't need to have connections. You don't need to win every time. You just need to refuse to stay down. That's what Abraham Lincoln did. That's what greatness always does. In a one-room log cabin in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness, a child was born into a life that had nothing to offer except hardship. No fame, no legacy, no name, just dirt floors, cold winters, and long silent nights. That boy was Abraham Lincoln, the man history would one day call the great emancipator. But at birth, the world saw just another forgotten child from nowhere. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a wandering farmer, barely scraping by. His mother, Nancy, would die young, leaving him with a hole in his soul that would never quite heal. In those early years, Abraham had no schooling, no books, no future, and yet, inside him burned something the world couldn't see, a quiet, a storm of purpose, forged by pain. He didn't grow up with privilege, he grew up with problems. He didn't get a head start. He started way behind. But here's the part people miss. That disadvantage was his edge. The world didn't hand him anything, so he learned to earn everything. He picked up whatever books he could find, walking miles just to borrow one. By candlelight, he'd teach himself to read, to write, to dream not of riches, not of comfort, but of becoming someone worthy of being remembered. And that's the first great truth of Lincoln's life. He wasn't born a legend. He built himself brick by brick, loss by loss, failure by failure. At 22, he left home with nothing but ambition and a head full of dreams. He started a business and it failed. He ran for the state legislature and lost. He tried love and got rejected. He kept stepping up to the plate and kept striking out. Most men would have taken the hint. Most men would have walked away. But Lincoln, he didn't just stay, he grew. Because every setback was just another line in the blueprint of a man being built for greatness. He wasn't addicted to applause. He was addicted to the mission. And missions aren't smooth roads. They're battlegrounds. But the real war wasn't outside. It was within. Abraham Lincoln battled depression, the kind that swallows hope whole. They called it melancholy back then, but it was darker than words could describe. There were days he could barely function. Nights where he questioned whether life was even worth continuing. But this is what separates the great from the forgotten. He didn't wait to feel better. He acted anyway. While his soul bled quietly in the background, he stood tall in public, helping others, fighting for justice, and pushing through pain without complaint. His story wasn't about glory, it was about grit. In 1834, he finally won election to the Illinois state legislature. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't make him rich, but it gave him one thing he'd never had before, a foothold. From there, he taught himself law, again, no elite schooling, no mentors, just raw effort. He studied legal texts alone by firelight, reading until his eyes blurred. He passed the bar and became a lawyer, not because someone gave him a shot, but because he took one. And even then, even after climbing out of poverty and obscurity, he still faced ridicule. His clothes didn't fit, his voice was high, his appearance was awkward. They called him ugly, unsophisticated, a joke. But Abraham Lincoln didn't need approval. He needed purpose, and his was growing stronger with every insult. He kept running for office, and kept losing. Failed campaigns in 1838, another in 1843, one more in 1848, and still another heartbreak in 1855. Can you imagine that? 2 decades of constant failure, humiliation, rejection. Most people would have disappeared by then, but not Lincoln. Why? Because he understood something that the world still hasn't fully learned. You don't need to win to become unstoppable. You need to persist. He was a man who mastered the art of failing forward. Each defeat sharpened his focus. Each setback deepened his conviction. He wasn't chasing power, he was chasing purpose. And purpose doesn't expire with rejection. If anything, it gets louder. Louder in the silence, louder in the pain, louder in the dark. By 1858, Lincoln was well known for all the wrong reasons. Another Senate run, another loss. This time to Stephen A. Douglas, a man who represented everything Lincoln stood against. But that campaign changed everything. It wasn't the outcome that made history, it was the message. Lincoln's powerful debates, his moral clarity, his refusal to back down on slavery, awakened a sleeping nation. He may have lost the seat, but he won the voice of a generation. And in that loss, destiny made its move. 2 years later, the impossible happened. Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. A man who had failed more times than he had won. A man the elites mocked. A man who had battled depression, poverty, and isolation his entire life. But now, that man stood at the helm of a nation on the brink of civil war. Not because he was flawless, not because he was charismatic, but because he had endured, because he had grown through everything the world threw at him. And when he got to the top, he didn't forget the bottom. He didn't bask in power, he used it to fight for those who had none. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the preservation of the Union. These weren't just political acts, they were the culmination of a lifetime of resilience, forged in the fires of failure. Lincoln led a broken nation not by shouting, but by standing firm in what was right, even when it hurt, even when it cost him everything. Because leadership isn't about being the loudest, it's about being the last one standing when everyone else has given up. That's what Lincoln embodied. That's what makes him timeless. Not his victories, but the storms he survived. So when you think about giving up, when failure knocks the wind out of you, when rejection makes you question your worth, when the road ahead looks too long, too hard, too dark, remember this man. Remember that he failed over and over for 30 years, that he was laughed at, counted out, broken down, and that he still rose. Not because the world believed in him, but because he believed in something greater. This is not a story about a president. This is a story about a man who kept getting back up, This is your reminder that greatness isn't built in success. It's built in the trenches, in the silence, in the heartbreaks, in the moments when nobody is watching and you keep going anyway. Abraham Lincoln didn't win every battle, but he won the war that mattered, the one against his own limits, and that made him unstoppable. The world has changed since Abraham Lincoln took his last breath, but the lessons his life left behind are eternal. He may have walked this earth in the 1800s, but his spirit speaks louder in today's world than ever before, because now, more than ever, we live in a time where people want instant success, applause, fame, and shortcuts. But Lincoln's life spits in the face of that illusion. His story says, don't chase speed, chase substance. Don't chase the spotlight, chase purpose. Don't run from failure, let it forge you. Because the truth is this: the most powerful force on earth is a human being who refuses to give up. And Lincoln was that force. You see, greatness doesn't always look like glory. Sometimes it looks like a man who walks alone for years, stumbling through defeat after defeat, getting mocked, questioned, and betrayed, but never losing sight of why he started. That's what Lincoln was. Not a man of glamour, but a man of grit. Not a man of entitlement, but of endurance. He didn't wait to be chosen, he chose himself, again and again. And in doing so, he gave every underdog, every outsider, every broken soul the blueprint for becoming something more. Taught us that your pain can either poison you or power you, that your past does not define your future, that leadership is not about being perfect, it's about staying present, about holding steady when the storm hits hardest, about believing in people who don't even believe in themselves yet. He taught us that a poor boy with a broken heart and a borrowed book could one day change the destiny of a nation, even now. Lincoln is more than a face on a penny or a statue in DC. He is a symbol, a mirror held up to every person who thinks they're not enough, to every dreamer who's lost their way, to every fighter who's tired, to every leader who's questioned their worth. His life is a whisper that says, keep going, you're closer than you think. You are being built, not broken. And maybe that's the most powerful thing of all. He didn't live to see the full fruits of his labor. He didn't bask in the legacy. He didn't hear the history books declare him the greatest. He didn't see his face carved into stone, but he acted anyway because his goal wasn't recognition. It was responsibility. And that's the difference between temporary fame and timeless impact. So if you're walking through your own darkness, if you're doubting, hurting, or questioning your path, remember Abraham Lincoln. Remember that success isn't a straight line. It's a battlefield. And you don't need to be perfect to win. You just need to keep showing up, broken, bruised, barely standing but still standing. That's what he did. And that's what you must do. Because the world doesn't need more polished leaders, it needs more purposeful ones. People who are willing to lead with love, even when they're hated. People who are willing to take hits and keep walking. People who are willing to lose, to fall, to bleed for something bigger than themselves. That's the fire Abraham Lincoln carried. And if you let it, it can burn in you too.